ASME Legislative Fellow in the office of Congressman Tom Reed, who is co-chair of the House Manufacturing Caucus, along with Representative Tim Ryan of Ohio. So this is our first Manufacturing Caucus briefing of this year. We are going to try and have a few of these over the next 3 months that are related to manufacturing communities and ecosystems. And so our first briefing today is how manufacturing incubators and accelerators are powering economic growth across the U.S. And so you're going to hear from a great panel of people that are right on the front lines to do this. But before we get that going, I wanted to remind everyone that Manufacturing USA and the Manufacturing USA Institutes are integral to this topic. You can go online at manufacturingusa.com to look at the Deloitte report, which is an independent third-party report on the value of the manufacturing institutes and how they form a great network across the country in various areas. So I encourage you to go look at that. Also, there is the 2016 annual report that's there. The 2017 annual report, I'm told, is due out soon. So hopefully that'll be out on the website as well. So please go look at those. So without any further ado, I want to introduce to you Greg Spielberg, who is the Director of Cities Strategies at Second Muse, and he will take it from here. Thank you. Greg?
Thanks. Thank you. Thanks for spending some time with us this afternoon. Andy, thank you, and thank you to the House Manufacturing Caucus. And all the panelists who came down here, and everyone who came down. We're going to talk about manufacturing incubators today with voices that represent 6 different cities, all very different in different parts of the country. We hear a lot about manufacturing. Typically, we hear about manufacturing either because it's being shipped off to other countries or because big public corporations are either thriving or dying. What's happening at the same time is that 21st century manufacturing is in its infancy. Let's say some people say it's 3 years old, some people say it's 10 years old. In New York City, manufacturing has been growing across all 5 boroughs since 2010. So when we think about incubators and when we think about startups and startup manufacturers and how startup hardware companies can interface with legacy manufacturers, we're talking about it because this is the new scale and these are the new growth areas for the entire century. This isn't an outlier. These are not maker spaces. These are not an alternative way to view manufacturing in the United States. This is a core. 10 years when we come back, or if you look at these organizations in 10 years, you're going to see the same type of scale that they'll talk about experiencing over the past year or 2 years, 3 years, 4 years, half a decade. The growth and the impact that they're having in their cities is pretty incredible. And if you dig under the hood afterwards and see how much money is needed to invest in the growth and in the impact that they're talking about, it's pennies compared to what we invest in a lot of different elements across the United States, all of which are very important. But this is a new model and way of thinking about growing manufacturing here. There's a few things to keep in mind, I think, which we'll hear a lot more about. One is the face of manufacturing is changing a lot and has changed a lot. 5 women on the panel. We always hear about no women in manufacturing, no women in leadership. There are women in manufacturing leading massive investments and massive spaces that are helping companies led by men and women in all these countries. So in all these, counties and cities. So there's a new face of manufacturing. The second part is that startups are building absolutely brilliant companies and brilliant products. They're not just creating the same type of tools and the same type of machinery that we've seen in the past. They're creating smart IoT devices that integrate throughout entire cities to give cities better understanding of waste systems, trash systems, transportation systems, clean energy, which decreases the amount that cities have to spend on a massive scale. And understanding what startups are working on and what they actually need is essential to creating deal flow for legacy manufacturers. The third piece is just thinking about how little understanding startups often have of the ecosystem around them. We have a company called Next Generation Energy Management Systems in New York City, which was started by a graduate of NYU. It looks essentially like a smoke detector, but what it does is it sends messages to first responders, letting them know where people are and how many people there are in a building in the case of a fire or an attack or any sort of other emergency. They've mastered the actual IoT device inside, and they've also mastered the communication from the device to law enforcement. What they can't figure out how to do is get the simple casing injection molded. Through an incubator program, we're able to very quickly connect them to manufacturers in the area who can give them quotes, or connect them with a community of peers who can very quickly get them the resources they need. Today we're going to go from east to west. So we're going to start with Michaela Morrill from Greentown in Boston and end with Haven Allen in Chicago. Everyone has very different models, and just looking forward to a fascinating conversation. Thank you.
Do you all hear me? Yeah? Okay, cool. Hi. No. Now I did it. Okay. Is that better? We'll get there. Hi, so my name is Michaela Morrill, and I represent Greentown Labs, which is the largest clean tech hardware incubator in the country. I'm going to go ahead and define that because I think there's a really good chance that you're going to hear different definitions of incubator and accelerator. So for us, we have 100,000 square feet of space that is dedicated to both co-working areas and research labs because we have hardware startups. Our companies come in on a rolling basis, and they've already been through what I would consider an accelerator, so they've learned quite a bit about how to be a business. We just help support them as they grow into a larger scale-up business. We provide a whole host of resources that they can pick and choose, with the exception of the manufacturing initiative, which is what I run, which directly connects our startups with local manufacturers. So we go out and we meet area machine shops, SMEs. We find out who wants to work with startups, and then we connect them once we've made sure our startups are going to be good customers. Just to test the room, how many people have been in a machine shop? Cool. Why did you go? No, tell me, why'd you go? To build something, okay. How many people have ever been part of a hardware startup? Part of a hardware startup. Have you ever started a hardware company? Okay, that's awesome. I think for those of you who have never been through the process of starting a hardware startup, it is very different than a software startup or an app, because if you make a mistake, it takes a lot more time and a lot more money to fix your product than it does if you've coded something. Now, I can't code, so I don't want to take away from the fact that I think it's quite tricky, but it doesn't have the same space requirements, it doesn't require some of the same knowledge, and it doesn't require the same amount of capital investment. And so what we really try to do is help our startups understand that manufacturers who are hopefully ultimately going to create their end product are some of their best partners that they can have from a very early stage. And we do that in a lot of different ways, but I think what's most interesting and important is that of the manufacturers we've worked with, and we've got about 190. Now, to give you an idea, in Massachusetts, we're a very small state, but we have over 7,000 manufacturers, including some very large OEMs. 190 is a big number, but it's like, what, 2% of that? But we have a lot of people who recognize that startups could be the future of their business. The manufacturers who I talk to who are interested in working with startups often view themselves as a startup if they buy a new machine, or they're very interested in the fact that they could get their staff involved in some cutting-edge technology. We listen to them to learn what it is we can do to be helpful to their business, because we know, particularly in Massachusetts, that manufacturing has been a backbone of our economy for a long time, and it can continue to be that way. Just as a fun fact that I learned while I've been doing this job, how many people have flown in the last week? Okay, how many people have flown in the last year? All right, cool. 30% of every commercial airline is made in Massachusetts. I'm gonna leave you with that.
All right. I'm glad I get to go after someone who defined Incubator and Accelerator. I'm Katie Metzroth. I'm a senior director at Second Muse. We run a set of programs that we call community-sourced incubators. The one that we're most proud of is funded by NYC EDC. We have David and May from NYC EDC in the front row. It's called FutureWorks Incubator. It's part of a broader investment by the City of New York to really bring back and invest in advanced manufacturing in the city. We started working, well, we partnered with NYC EDC about 4 years ago, and at that time, we completely redesigned the program, which was called Next Top Makers at the time. What we found when we went into the process of redesigning was that entrepreneurs making physical products didn't necessarily identify with the terminology maker. They saw themselves as engineers, as roboticists, as designers, and so we had to find ways to bring all of those people into the same room. So what came out of that eventually evolved into FutureWorks Incubator, which now we would call the largest city-backed hardware incubator in the country. We went from supporting 6 companies last year to 85 this past program, something that none of us thought was possible 4 years ago, which gives you a sense of how fast the landscape is changing and how important it is to pay attention to these innovators and people who are making new physical products, because they're growing and they're growing rapidly. Just to give you a sense of what we do through that program, we don't give any funding. We also don't take any equity. Our entire mission is about making New York City a really easy, wonderful place to start a hardware company. There's a couple of reasons that is incredibly challenging, one being that real estate is incredibly expensive. What that means in the hardware context is it's hard to find appropriate space to kind of play and be messy and use machines. It's also difficult to find affordable office space and warehousing and manufacturing space, and so, I'm being waved off. And so these are some of the things that we had to tackle through the program. Sorry, I got distracted. When we first started, it was very hard for hardware entrepreneurs to actually find the appropriate physical space. So as we partnered with NYCDC, we were able to identify that network of space and having access to different types of machines and understanding what those machines did was a critical part of supporting hardware entrepreneurs. And so we started a program called FutureWorks Shops, which is actually connecting prototyping and contract manufacturers across New York City. We learned that there was a demand for this type of service, and so we were able to partner with these contract manufacturers in 9 different spaces and help them create a narrative, a cohesive narrative of what can be made and where, and then help people learn about it. So last year we supported those spaces to host, I think, 30-some events and educational opportunities to learn about their manufacturing business. We had over 1,000 attendees come out to those events, and 79% of those folks had never heard of these spaces. So not only is incubation and acceleration of these new technologies really important, it's also really important to invest in connecting the spaces and manufacturers that already exist in an ecosystem, because that's a critical need of the startups that we're working with. And then one last thing, because of this work in New York City, we connected with folks at the state who are now investing in a curriculum to design a curriculum that focuses on helping startups to navigate the manufacturing process. Part of that is very much based on what Michaela has built at Greentown, identifying manufacturing partners who are interested in startups and are interested in new technology, and also supporting the startups to be ready to have those conversations when it comes time. So I'll hand it over to Lauren.
Okay. My name is Lauren Rivette, and I'm here on behalf of 43 North. 43 North is a global business competition or startup competition based out of Buffalo, New York. We actually invest $5 million each year into startups. Has anyone here actually ever heard of 43 North? Show of hands. Okay, wonderful. So we travel all over the country, and we used to travel all over the world, meeting with investors and meeting with companies trying to encourage them to move to Buffalo with the carrot that we have funding available for them. How this program kind of came to be, Governor Cuomo, back in 2011, announced $1 billion for Buffalo. It was a huge marketing push, but there was real money behind it. And as part of that process, they conducted some research as to what Buffalo's economy needed to succeed. And out of that research, we found that Buffalo was missing a really key piece for economic growth, and that's entrepreneurial ecosystem. We did not have one. We did not have a base of tech companies. We didn't have strong founders to mentor other folks who might want to start a company. And so we sought to change that through a number of different programs, and the biggest being 43 North. The state gives us $5 million every year to select 8 to 10 companies to invest in. We do take an equity stake in those companies, move them to Buffalo. We require them to stay in Buffalo for 12 months and incubate with us. And the ultimate goal is to have them retained in Buffalo, creating jobs and impacting our community. In terms of how we deal with manufacturing startups, when this program came to be, we were industry agnostic. We would invest in any company we thought was innovative and strong and went through our competition. And I'll back up for a second. We get about 500 applications per year, and we narrow that down to about 8 to 10 investments, depending on the dollar amount we want to invest in that company. We found out that there are some companies that do better in Buffalo. We found out that if we really want to retain companies, we need to build upon our strengths as a community. A tech company can go anywhere, a software company. And they are a great fit in Buffalo. They can build nice sales teams. They can hire people for a much lower salary than, for instance, New York City. So we had some strengths there that we could build on. But I think even a better strength we had was our manufacturing history and expertise that was local. We had Bethlehem Steel in Buffalo. We have a Ford plant, a GM plant. We have a number of food manufacturers, and we have a great wealth of knowledge in that area. And so we found when we invested in manufacturing companies or companies that had a manufacturing component, we had more than just the money as leverage to keep them in Buffalo. We had a community to support them, and we had resources for them. So our programming around manufacturing companies is a bit similar to what some of the other folks have said, linking them to the appropriate contract manufacturer. These are really capital-intensive projects for the most part, so our investment, while it's pretty big, of $500 to $1 million, we do have to help them get additional investment. Typically, they're going to need to raise another $3 to $5 million in their year with us in order to get their product off the ground. Linkage to distributors, depending on the product, if it's a consumer good, linking them to the appropriate kind of retail locations. So it's a lot more difficult to work with some of these startups, but I think the payoff has been really strong. I'll give you one quick example of a company that is doing really well in Buffalo. It's called Ultracell Insulation. They make insulation from cellulose material and corrugated cardboard. What's interesting about them is they applied for our competition not just for the money, but because they wanted to come to Buffalo because they thought it would be economically advantageous to them. Their product is made from cardboard, which is recycled material from a plant in Niagara Falls, one of probably the worst pollution kind of stories and histories in our country. So they're taking that recycled material, turning it into insulation to insulate homes. Obviously, Buffalo is very cold. We have an old housing stock, so they're able to save homeowners money on their heating, on their heat bill. And so we brought them into the incubator. We invested $500,000 into them. They've since gone on to raise another $8 million, and they are building a plant right outside of Buffalo in one of our suburbs, hiring a local workforce, and we anticipate to see about 35 jobs just in that project alone. All of 43 North's companies combined, we've built about 180 full-time jobs in Buffalo, 400 globally. So we have a lot more work to do, but I think the key takeaway for me from 43 North is the big money kind of spoke volumes and got the community interested and got I think, the startup world interested, but we've realized that we have to back that up with resources and expertise to help these companies actually grow and retain them in Buffalo.
Well, it's very interesting for me as part of the panel to hear all of our different ways to approach a similar problem, and it's quite educational for me as well to hear the diversity of our approaches here. My name is Afshan Khan. I am part of Alpha Lab Gear Innovation Works, and we are part of the Ben Franklin Technology Partners in southwestern Pennsylvania. We are the longest running and oldest economic development tech-based program in the U.S. We've been supported by Democratic and Republican legislations for the last 35 years. And we are, at any point in time, one of the top 5 seed stage investors in the country, depending on the quarter. Proud to say last quarter, we are the top most active seed stage investor in the country. We've invested total Innovation Works over 400 companies that have gone on to raise about $2.2 billion in follow-on funding. Totally, this is including hardware and software. We employ about 18,000 people and generate $3.3 billion of revenue. So as part of Innovation Works, Alpha Lab Gear, approximately 5 years ago, was one of the first 5 hardware accelerators in the U.S., and thank you, Michaela, for defining an accelerator. And as part of our programs, we are leading the charge on doing a lot of the connections and a lot of the resources and the networks, but we're also doing a focus on design and design for manufacturing, and I'm going to elaborate on that a little bit. At Alpha Lab Gear, companies get a relatively modest amount compared to Buffalo, but they get anywhere from $50,000 to $150,000 in investment. We have over between 250 and 300 applications for about 8 spots in 2 cycles in a year. They get some really cool working space in a very nice, trendy part of town. And they get a very intense curriculum. We establish goals and milestones at the beginning of each cycle and drive those hard through a combination of programming, education, resources, networks, mentors, and a lot of support in terms of design and manufacturing connections and advice. It was the first hardware accelerator founded by a woman, my counterpart, Managing Director Ilana Diamond. And we started a new cycle last year in the fall, focusing specifically on scaling manufacturing. And as we did this pilot, as you find out with a pilot, right, we're iterative. We're building this as we go. We found that the design for manufacturing piece is critical to companies to understand how they go from their initial prototypes to actually scaling, even from small volumes to more mid-volume, I would say. So I wanted to give you a few examples of that. A company actually that relocated from Boston called Maven Machines was focused on hearables and wearables. The gentleman came to the Alpha Lab Gear program, built a team from scratch in Pittsburgh, and he was focused on hearables with biometric sensors to be able to detect movements of eyes, attention, head nodding. And when he came in, some folks in our group were skeptical. They thought, well, you know, there's a lot of wearables, hearables out there. You know, what's his initial target market? He's a very good listener, and he went out there and really researched, where can I have this tech really make an impact? And so the first part of his time in our program, he hung out at a lot of truck stops and found out that truckers and companies that employ even independent truckers have a big problem with fatigue on the road. And so he had designed, through a lot of trial and error and lots of mistakes along the way, he designed a specialized headset for truckers to wear that is measuring them and that is monitored by the dispatch center, so that if there is not a consistency among checking side to view mirrors, if there's not a consistency with head down versus head up, the dispatch can sort of monitor that situation and see if that trucker needs some help or needs to be guided off the road. He's applying that to other industries as well, but it was a very interesting first market. And from a manufacturing standpoint, he wasn't sure whether he was going to start it here in the United States. But what he did do was end up doing a hybrid. He developed the IP here. He assembles the final part here, but he got the headsets, which apparently are not made in America anymore, over in China. So it's a really good example of very different creative ways to tackle manufacturing. And one big part of that, as we're learning in our manufacturing cycle, and I've talked too long, sorry, is thinking about design for manufacturing.
Thank you, Afshan. My name is Brittany Mendez, and I am the Director of Program Management at the Youngstown Business Incubator. Thank you for the other panelists for really laying the groundwork for what I'm about to share with you today. But I think the most exciting thing for me being here from Youngstown is to see all that's unfolded even since I started at the incubator in 2012. And to show how additive manufacturing is not only changing our organization, but all of Northeast Ohio. It's been 6 crazy, amazing short years for me, but I'd love to tell you a little bit more about that. So I think our best is yet to come, and I think advanced manufacturing is really why I believe that. You know, when telling the history of YBI, which I think is important, we always kind of joke that we had 2 birthdays. In 1995, when we took an abandoned furniture store and turned it into a multi-use incubator. And then again in 2001, when we aligned ourselves with the state of Ohio's Development Services Agency, their entrepreneurial signature program. Underwent a ton of research with that process and found that software was really where we needed to start, specifically business to business, because no one cares where the location is for a software company. So since launching our technology incubator in 2001, we've been ranked as the #1 university-affiliated incubator in the world in Youngstown, Ohio, so we think that's pretty awesome. And in 2009, we had the fastest growing software startup in the world. So I think we all know the adage by Mark Twain, the 2 most important days of your life are the day that you're born and the day that you find out why. It may sound cheesy, but I believe in August of 2012, we found our why. After a really grueling application process and not a ton of belief from our community, but a great amount of support from Congressman Ryan and his staff, our then 3-building campus grew to 4 with the addition of the National Additive Manufacturing Innovation Institute, which was then known as NAMI, but now known as America Makes. And for Youngstown, Ohio, to get the very first manufacturing institute under the Obama administration was kind of unbelievable. So we really took that opportunity and dove headfirst into the advanced manufacturing space. Shortly after America Makes made its home on our campus, we were involved in a project 3D printing sand for the metal casting industry, and that really put YBI on the map in the manufacturing space. And since that program launched, we can say that we've proudly worked with Ford Motor Company, Cummins, Caterpillar, and so many more in helping them to get adopting that technology. We've created a world-class, one-of-a-kind ecosystem between America Makes and Youngstown State University, which has really taken advanced manufacturing into their blood and purchased a ton of equipment. And because of those great partnerships, you know, we've been able to secure now over $12 million in grant funding to do tech transfer and commercialization work. And, you know, we have a ton of great state partners, but the federal government has been a great partner for us. Proud to say that more than half of that $12 million in funding has come from the federal government. Not the least of which was funding our building #5, which is really our manufacturing space. Since we've also been on this journey, we launched our Advanced Tooling Acceleration Program, which teaches SMEs how and when to adopt AM for low-volume tooling applications. It's been a really exciting model for us, and we're actually in the phase of monetizing that because we've been able to engage our startup manufacturers and OEMs through that process as well. So after we began some expertise in AM on a very large level, it just made sense for us to open our incubator doors and expand our core technology program, incubation and accelerator programs into AM, and we started working with additive startups. Since 2004, it's been a slow go, but we're proud to say that we have 12 AM and 3DP startups, most of which are located right in downtown Youngstown. Primarily focused around hardware, a lot of people who are working on printers themselves, extrusion heads, and some materials. Our hope is to eventually expand that into the entire supply chain. We do have some great synergies between our additive program and our core digital programs, which have now expanded into industrial Internet of Things, AI, flexible electronics, and even a little bit of biomedical, which is really great because in the state of Ohio, we've been working with Team NEO to really find synergies between their clusters in biomedical and flexible electronics, smart devices and systems, and really see the impact that all of those can have together. And we actually launched an additive manufacturing cluster as well. Because of the cluster, we envision that by 2023, Northeast Ohio will be a leader in design and engineering for AM, materials innovation, and what I'm most excited about, entrepreneurial innovation and investment. So we've now launched our own venture capital fund, which works with software and hardware startups, as long as they're in the state of Ohio. And we've began international attraction efforts, working with Israeli companies. Our first one has actually started U.S. operations in downtown Youngstown. Hearing things like, I wish we had this in Israel is really exciting for us. So, when no one almost believed, we set the groundwork to get the $70 million Innovation Institute in downtown Youngstown and start our own venture capital fund. And when no one believed in us, we began a journey to take us to become the #1 university-affiliated incubator in the world. And I sit here today, they believe us now, and I hope that you guys do too.
Hello, everyone. My name is Haven. I am the CEO of MHub. MHub is a physical product innovation center in Chicago, Illinois. Today, I'm going to answer 3 questions. First, what is MHub, why it was created, and what is its business model? And then I'm going to tell you a little bit about our impact, our vision for the future, and tell you about 2 community stories from the companies that are working out of there. MHub is both a community and a place. Our community right now, after 1 year, consists of over 700 users from 150 companies, 50 mentors mentoring those companies, our 25 board members, and over 25 corporate partners, and also hundreds of small and medium-sized manufacturers. Our place, we have a 63,000 square foot state-of-the-art electronics lab about 1 mile from downtown Chicago. This used to be a former Motorola cell phone prototyping and testing lab that they had just sunk $22 million into it before they were purchased by Lenovo and officially shut the facility down 18 months later. Nowadays, it houses 10 different labs, state-of-the-art 3D printers, CNC machines, laser cutting machines, everything you need to make a physical product company. In total, our companies have about $5 million worth of prototyping equipment and software. There's co-working space and public meeting space as well. In the first year alone, MHub held over 300 events, had thousands of training and mentor hours, and we welcomed over 50,000 visitors. So why was it created? MHub was built upon the idea that if you attract and cultivate high-skilled STEM talent, provide them with access to capital-intensive resources, and connect them with industry, we would be able to generate enormous economic value. This would be done through the creation of new intellectual property, new businesses, creation of new jobs, which would generate revenue and garner more investment. It was founded by a local EDC called World Business Chicago, an NNMI called UI Labs, and the Illinois Science and Technology Coalition, and done so under the leadership of the Advisory Council for Chicagoland Manufacturing. This group had a specific directive to make Chicago an advanced manufacturing hub for the 21st century. To accomplish this, they focused on They first focused their attention on the workforce development, productivity, and innovation capacity throughout the region. In the 3 years that it was running, it created job training programs, placement programs, apprenticeship programs. It helped launch and fund a national network of manufacturing institute known as DMDII, and secured a manufacturing communities designation, supported local buy initiatives, export initiatives, and ultimately MHub. All these efforts were undertaken to counteract negative industry trends in Chicago, such as in 10 years, we lost 200,000 manufacturing jobs, or over 1/3 of our manufacturing workforce. There's also a significant reduction in corporate R&D, resulting in an eroding and underperforming industry. In Illinois, manufacturing makes up 86% of the R&D spending. So if our manufacturing's not spending, our whole economy is going down. But it's still a rather large industry. There are 14,000 manufacturers in the Chicagoland region, still employing over 400,000 people and generating about $78 billion towards the gross regional product. Our business model, we are a 501c3, but we currently have no public dollars. So yeah, we're a 501c3 nonprofit economic development organization. We have 3 primary revenue sources. 40% comes from membership dues and rents. 40% comes through corporate partnerships, and I'll get a little bit more into that, but this is very much the industry helping fund its own future, again, by attracting talent in sort of that business and investment pool. And then the other 20% comes from services that we offer. We didn't launch MHub alone. We brought in partners together to do so. We put out an RFP in February of 2015, had 28 different organizations across the country respond to that RFP and selected a few of them. Collectively, those ones that we brought together, we're making about $180,000 in revenue in 2015. By 2016, when starting to work with us, we had generated over $900,000. Last year, over $3 million, and this year, collectively, we're gonna approach $6 million in revenue through those 3 different revenue sources. And we're also looking to develop 2 new potential revenue streams. One, because we have this amazing pool of 700 engineers, our small and medium-sized manufacturers are asking for access to those engineers. So we're actually sending our engineers out to do 1, 2, 3-week jobs for our small, medium manufacturers that can't afford R&D on staff. And then, like many of these other programs, we are also launching an accelerator and looking to raise our own venture capital fund. We're still seeking to develop a sustainable revenue model to support further K through 12 and STEM education programming, but we currently haven't quite figured that out. Our year 1 impact, so we launched officially last March in 2017. Based on our first year impact, our companies that work there, those 150 companies, generated over $19 million in revenue. They garnered about $18 million in investment capital. They developed and launched over 250 products for their companies, as well as some local manufacturers, and created 350 jobs. 76% of the manufacturing that they did from a total dollar amount was done with United States manufacturers. Let's skip ahead. I'm going to tell you 2 quick stories about companies that are at MHub. First one, I'm going to call it Company A. This team was developed out of Northwestern. They developed a technology to measure amps coming off of manufacturing equipment. This tells manufacturers their throughput, whether they have any variation in their production. Immediately upon graduating, they joined HACS, one of the top hardware accelerators in the world, very much set up to help make sure those companies are developing their supply chains in Shenzhen, China. After MHub launch, we actually convinced them to come back to Chicago. Just recently, they closed their Series A round, raising $4 million, and currently employ over 8 people. But their CEO is not an American citizen. In August, his visa will be up. He doesn't know where he's going to be. He may have to go back to India, or I'm sure Shenzhen, China would happily take him back because their company currently is worth over $40 million. Company 2, right? This was developed at the University of Illinois. is backed by over $30 million in research funded by the U.S. Department of Navy to create the ability to communicate wirelessly underwater. Huge implications in industries like oil and gas and submersibles. Today, they're on SBIR2 grant, using these funds to optimize their technology for commercialization. I bring up both of those examples because they're products developed at our universities that didn't have a place to go after they lose access to their labs and their world-class professors, and now they're moving into centers like ours to become real businesses.
That was awesome. Thank you all for sharing so many different stories. It's amazing to see the impact from physical spaces to citywide incubators to accelerators coming out of tech programs and coming out of a lot of wasted money on Motorola's part. It makes me think of the report that you mentioned, Lauren, the Brookings report about like the model to bring young people essentially back to Buffalo, which is a plight that a lot of cities have had. And what they found was the #1 way to rebuild your city was to give students out of college, out of grad school, a home and a reason to stay home, because everyone wants to stay near where they grew up for the most part, as long as there's an opportunity. So it was great to hear kind of how you guys are all helping to build your city, and how using manufacturing is a great tool, and using urban development is a great strategy to be able to communicate with people and governments who are looking for the best use of their money. I have a question. I know Andy has a question too, and then we would love to open up to everyone in the room for questions. Does that sound good? Does anybody have questions? Yeah? Okay, amazing. I'll go with question. Andy, we're going to keep responses to 2 minutes or less. It's tricky, but we'll just get more voices heard that way. Keep questions to 30 seconds or less. Sometimes we like to give our entire background story when we give a question. There'll be time to talk after and also in the future. Michaela and Katie, curious, you have a big space, 57,000 square feet or so? 100,000 square feet. You have no space, but you partner with spaces throughout the city. How do you, maybe Michaela first, how do you serve the people who are already in your space and like not offend them while reaching out and creating access to kind of anyone who wants to come in? We've seen a lot of incubators that are just empty buildings. So how do you create that vibrancy?
Okay, so I guess, I don't think I said this, but Greentown Labs currently has, thank you.
Sorry.
It's like 99,782, but we'll say 100,000 square feet for nice round number purposes, and we house 76 startups. That said, so that's Greentown Labs. The manufacturing initiative that I run will work with any hardware startup that comes to us, and that's because there's such a strong need. And so I guess, I think I'm going to answer your question with this, but the space is incredibly important because our Greentown Labs members, the whole idea is if you go design something, and just like you said, Haven, right? Like, you've been kicked out of your lab because you graduated from college, is a very common story that we hear, but it's not the only one. Or you grew out of your basement, or you need access to something else. You come to a place like a Greentown, you have a prototype, you have the space to actually like go design something and then go work on it. And from there, you have this whole network and resource of people who are doing some of the same things you are. Even if someone is designing a completely different product, you're in the same stage. Like maybe you're right on the cusp of the Valley of Death. If I say that term, do people know what I mean? Valley of Death? Yeah, okay, cool. If you don't, find me afterwards. But you're right on this precipice and you're scared, but there's other people around you. I think even if you don't have physical space, if you bring people together who are asking a lot of the same questions, I'm going to tell the fastest story in like 30 seconds. I think even without space, you can help bring people in and make them realize that there's a common way to find answers and they're asking a lot of the same questions. As an example, what I do at Greentown, people will come to me and they'll be like, hey, I need your help. I know everything. I'm a genius. I just need to find an injection molder who will help me make this. I don't know how much you guys know about injection molding, but it's probably a terrible idea. Because what I'll say is, okay, well, why do you think you need an injection molder? And they're like, well, my buddy used an injection molder. I'm like, okay, how many are you making? They say 10. You shouldn't injection mold 10 of anything. Injection molds run from $35,000 to $120,000. So that's the most expensive pen you've ever seen. But then we ask why. Why did you think you needed to injection mold? And because your buddy did it is not good enough. And then we tell them what they should be doing instead. And why do they need to make 10? Maybe you should make 50, and then that'll be cheaper anyway. And we break these things down, and those are the kind of questions you can have with a group of people. And they don't need space, but it really helps because then if they do, they can go run around and work on things together if they choose to. Did I answer your question?
Great.
Awesome.
I forgot the question. The question's about how not to alienate people using space.
How do you serve your base?
Okay,
And also get
got
the
it.
kind of fresh blood that you need to.
Got it. Okay, so we don't have a physical space. Michaela's space is amazing. We've been there. It's an incredible place I would love to move into. In New York City, we have a different set of challenges. So one of the things we have found is because when we first started this work, there were very few spaces that were actually appropriate for hardware, but there were 2 or 3 that we knew about and we were friendly with. And so we decided, because this is an economic development program and the angle is to help build successful long-term businesses, that also applies to the spaces throughout the city. Our ability to connect across these spaces and start to raise awareness that they exist and also to help them understand the needs of hardware startups has actually led to a proliferation of spaces. Now the city is a place where you can find almost anything, all sorts of different types of machines, different types of communities, some in your neighborhood, some you have to travel to, but the way that we're able to kind of bring them together is by making it very clear that our mission is about making sure people know about them and making sure that our incubator companies know that they have options. We've actually found it to be incredibly liberating. Again, New York City is very different than a lot of cities in the country, but for us to be able to work through this network of spaces means that we have access to a much broader community of people, and we also have lots of additional options that we wouldn't have if we were anchored to one space in particular. Is that?
Okay, so I have a question that anybody and everybody can answer, but I think maybe I'll start with Lauren, because I think this is the problem that we have in a lot of places in the country that, aren't really urban, sort of less urban, maybe even rural, that there's been a flight of manufacturers and even workforce and even talented people from those parts of the country into the more dense urban centers looking for work. But from your experiences, how would you apply what you've learned to these less urban, non-urban, even rural areas on how you get an incubator going or provide that service in these areas and potentially have it sustainable? What are some of the issues that, and experiences you have that could help them?
So we're not necessarily rural, but I'll say that we're probably not the first community you think of when you think about building a startup. You probably think about San Francisco, Toronto, New York City, Chicago, Boston. Buffalo's pretty low on that list, and we hear that from our entrepreneurs, but we pique their interest nonetheless for a number of reasons. But I would say my advice, if you're not in one of those top tier cities, is find out what your strengths are. For us, we have really, really affordable housing, a great quality of life. You can build a sales team in Buffalo for a third, for a quarter, maybe even an eighth of the cost that you would do in New York City. And because our economy is global in nature, and because the virtual nature of e-commerce and all of the ways that people buy goods these days, it really doesn't matter where you are. Aside from a couple of key strengths, Buffalo is a logistics hub. It's easy to get to a lot of different places, and from our area, we're within 500 miles of 90% of the North American population. So it's a great spot for someone making a product that's going to sell to people. For other communities, I would say you have to figure out what it is that your key strength is. But what we're very fortunate now is I think startups are moving away from Silicon Valley, and I think they're looking at other communities. They realize how expensive it is and how oversaturated it is to be in that location and to meet with investors that meet with hundreds of the same kind of company every day. I think that they like being in smaller markets, and I think there's a lot of strategic advantages for them to do that.
I'm happy to jump in. So making sort of an innovation or incubator throughout the United States, I think would be a little bit tough. There are some tough economics. The business models aren't as easy. You can hear from a lot of these places that they are severely government funded. But there are ways that there are downstream effects from the activities that we're doing that are going to touch wider rural areas. I know I talked a little bit about how we are farming out our talent to help them, our companies, have a much longer runway. But with that, small, medium-sized manufacturers that don't have access or can't afford R&D talent now has access to some of the best engineers in Chicago. So we're able to give them a low-cost sort of R&D option. We're also doing some workforce development, specifically on welding and CNC training. Those workers are not staying at MHub. They're going to become production workers. And then I would say lastly, hopefully everybody at MHub someday is going to be manufacturing. We're putting it upon us to figure out where those manufacturers are, what their capabilities are, so that when the individual startups are looking for companies, we say, go work with this company. So think about it as potentially driving more business development back into our existing manufacturing industry.
So sorry. So Greentown has its main location in Somerville, which is right outside of Boston. But we also have an office in Springfield, Massachusetts, which is in the I-91 corridor. It's closer to Hartford than it is to Boston. It's not particularly rural, but it's about as close to being rural in Massachusetts as you can be without being in the Berkshires. And it has had a number of challenges over the last 250 years, frankly. And what we have found, we went there for the manufacturing base. Despite those challenges, the I-91 corridor is still home to some of the largest DoD, I should just say defense OEMs, and one of the biggest supply chains in the country. But there was not a lot of innovation despite the fact that there's 17 colleges. And so what we have worked to do is to, kind of like you were saying, start to build this idea of an ecosystem. Something has to spark people. And so the city of Springfield partnered with one of their large companies, Mass Mutual, to also have a $5 million fund. They're giving it out in significantly smaller amounts than you guys are, but even $10,000 or $15,000 to small startups can be a game changer. And it was a decision by the city and this company to do it, but it has really had a ripple effect through the economy, particularly through an accelerator program called VVM, which started off by getting people who are interested in talking about new ideas together for beers at a bar. And they have now, I think, put out like 400 companies. Companies are moving into Springfield, Massachusetts, similar to Buffalo. I don't think that's where people think of necessarily as like, ooh, sweet, hotspot. But it is, and people are relocating there, and I think it's a really good opportunity and an example of how other cities can be thinking about how do you attract that talent, and then how do you continue to keep them there.
Can I add just one very quick thing? So New York City obviously has a lot of resources in terms of talent and spaces and options. The program we're running is a public program. It's geared at economic development. It's geared at understanding what is happening in the city and what gets in the way of the entrepreneur or the manufacturer when it comes to connecting to that community. That exact living lab petri dish is likely not going to happen in another city, but it can happen regionally or at the state level or even at a national level. So I would encourage folks to think about how this connected awareness raising, helping people understand what resources are available and are within kind of a reasonable distance is also an interesting way to think about building one of these programs.
Okay, all the hands that went up earlier. You want to go first?
No, it's okay, I'll speak loud.
Okay.
Good Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you so much for the gender balance and the gentleman for being there. We just finished the World Bank spring meetings, and I attended most of the FinTech events for 2 days seminar. And most of the FinTech people were women. So thank you so much, women and men. So my question is, how do we make a curriculum that can be for all the states, the 51 states in the United States, from apprenticeship to the manufacturing itself, because we don't just want to jump to the manufacturing without understanding the apprenticeship, because when we have the apprenticeship or curriculum, which we have, but not for here, for Africa, that apprenticeship will help people come up with the innovation on manufacturing, and then get specialist people for actually who will be working, because when it comes to manufacturing, we need really people who understand how will they do this, how will they work. So how can we come up with a really joint or global curriculum on manufacturing, starting from apprenticeship and skills training?
Akshan, do you want to take that to start?
I
You could kick it over if you
Or
want
maybe
to.
I'll kick it over. No.
I know Youngstown Business Incubator, we don't really do anything with apprenticeship or curriculum or trainings, but I do know that America Makes, our manufacturing institute under the NNMI, they do a lot of work with apprenticeships. They do a lot of work with developing the workforce that's necessary for, advanced manufacturing specifically. I know for our university, and then I'll pass it off to someone else because it's not our sweet spot, but our university, Youngstown State University, actually brought back a manufacturing engineering degree, which had fallen by the wayside many, many years ago. So I think in terms of, finding the expertise, I know University of Texas in El Paso, our satellite center for America Makes, they do a lot with manufacturing and, preparing the workforce appropriately. But
We do a lot of training, both on the technical and business side. I know one of the things that we were noticing at MHub initially is that people were coming there to build products, and we wanted to make sure that they were coming there to build businesses based on products. And with engineers, we had to really, we did lots of surveys and understanding where they were on their own sort of journey becoming a business, and are now rolling out several workshops around that. Everything from like financial modeling to customer discovery, determining whether you're really a small business, venture backable business. And right now there's 12 active courses. We're expanding that out to 30 this year. All those are being videotaped and will be available online.
Can I just add one other really super quick thing? Okay, so I think you actually have two questions, and I like both of them a lot. So one of them about the apprenticeships and like training actual manufacturing techs. I think lots of different states are doing have different programs for that, and NIST, the National Institute of Standards and Technology, I think, under the Department of Commerce, they fund a program called the Manufacturing Enterprise Program, the MEP program, and those operate in all of our states, and they often run training programs. I think they differ by state, but we're up here talking about incubators and manufacturing, and that's great, and it's incredibly important for economic development, but one of the reasons that manufacturing is having trouble growing is because there is no workforce available, right? We stopped training people in the 80s to become manufacturers, and that's a whole separate, 16 panels. But the second piece that you brought up too is it's training some of these entrepreneurs and engineers who work for them how to build things. Because you can be an engineer, and I hope I don't offend anyone here, and you can build one really awesome thing, and that's adorable. But that does not build a product or a company. You have to design for manufacturing, and the Department of Energy has just released what's called Build for Scale, which is essentially a manufacturing 101 program. It's a little dense, but it has everything you need to know if you want to design a product from prototype to scale. And I think that the more people can take that and use it for their purposes, will help with some of the other pieces, because that's going to train lots of people to do different things, because they will be thinking about it differently and frankly more correctly. I'm done.
So I just was curious about, a lot of you have talked a little bit about or mentioned the word maker, so I'm the executive director of an organization called Nation of Makers.
Sorry, executive director of.
Nation of Makers. And I'm agnostic as to whether or not people use the term maker. I kind of don't care. I care about the outcomes of what happens after you make. But there is sort of a pipeline that happens from that person that is making in a makerspace Accelerator, because now they have a product and they're trying to get to that business, they're trying to get to that knowledge that you spoke about. So I'm just curious, what things are you doing? And there was a little bit of a negative tone about the term maker, so I was actually curious, what has that been? And you spoke a little bit to it. And, there are some makerspaces that have been trying to create incubators within the makerspace because they've noticed that, a significant number of people don't just come to make some silly little, trinket, but they actually do want to come to learn how to start a product line of business. So I'm just curious.
I'm just going to clarify the term maker. What happened is, I think in the context that we were using it, maker tended to be folks that were not interested in commercializing. So the folks that wanted to push back a bit on that term. One of the things we're doing through our program is, because again, I keep saying this, it's publicly funded. So our metrics are about participation that reflects the community that we serve. So it needs to look like the population of New York City. It can't just be engineers trained at MIT. It has to be varying levels of education, all of it. One of the things we've done within that program is we've come up with 3 different tracks. So one of the tracks is idea stage, and we know that folks in that track may never start a business, but there's a lot of value in getting that creative energy and these ideas, and some of those people become the first, second, third hires of the companies that actually make it. So that's how we deal with the fact that some people aren't sure if they want to start a business or just have a really good idea and want that idea to be shared. So we create this platform where those folks are welcome in our program, and then they can advance to the next level if they're deciding to take it in that direction.
Do any of you have those programs with community makers?
No, it's a really good question. I mean, the Next Top Makers program started with
Makers.
people who were making and tooling around with graphene or with wearables or with kind of any idea that they came up with late at night. And the Makerspace network in New York City is very much a feeder for the FutureWorks program. And in 43 North, there's a great makerspace up there as well. And it's not only the entry point and the way to start tooling around in the most meaningful way that you could, just like playing, basketball on asphalt is the most meaningful way you can until you get into a big stadium. And it also is an important entry point for us in recruiting and channeling kind of the story of manufacturing down age-wise into schools, because makerspaces are colorful and fun and you can do something immediately on a 3D printer, whereas you're not going to capture anyone's imagination with a CNC mill until they understand what a CNC mill can do and how amazing that is. So it is an essential part of what we're doing.
And I'll just add, our first 100 members were from a maker community, and MHub itself stands for both maker and manufacturer. You look at our logo, it's 2 M's coming together. We're very intentional in driving those 2 communities together.
And the FutureWorks Shops program has university prototyping labs, it's got contract manufacturers, and it has maker spaces in it, so it legitimizes all of them and connects all of them, so they're part of the same conversation.
I promised you two. Yeah.
Well, first, thank Michaela for mentioning the manufacturing extension partnership. I'm a regional manager of the Southeast, so,
Awesome.
but my question is to you. Well, I heard through the other regional manager of the Midwest that they have an interaction with the, obviously the Institute and the Incubator. So how's the role between those 3 with regard to what do each one do and separate, their different roles? Do you know?
The MEP.
Yeah, I know that the MEP
YBI,
collaborates with the Incubator and obviously
and the
with America
Institute.
Makes. So all 3 of them are working together, and I just wonder, I don't have that in my region, so I just want to know, how do you do that
Yeah,
sharing of roles? And I think Chicago also too.
Yeah,
Wow.
absolutely.
So maybe I'll leave most of that to them. My role is largely on the incubation end, so dealing with manufacturers and the MEPs, and specifically America Makes isn't my bread and butter. But I do know that we are all part of the Northeast Ohio Additive Manufacturing Cluster. So we did an asset mapping study, really found out where all of these companies exist, and we all take the clients as an as-need basis. Obviously, America Makes does a lot of the R&D, and a lot of our cluster members are also now becoming America Makes members as well. So I know there's a lot of interplay there, but maybe Haven or Michaela would have a better insight for you.
Go ahead.
All right. Yeah, I would say our MEP, it's known as the Illinois Manufacturing Extension Partnership, is really the glue between, I would say, the small and medium-sized manufacturers and the activity that we're doing, and the same thing with DMDII. On the DMDII side, they're making sure that the Illinois manufacturers in the region are aware of the advancements going on in digital manufacturing and design, sort of doing some demystification, but making sure those project calls that are being defined that will have impact 5-10 years down the road, that people are aware of that technology as it's developing. And then with us, they are bringing lots of small, medium-sized manufacturers in, helping them, one, start engage with the workforce development aspects that we do, two, the R&D capabilities that we do to farm out, and then I would just say they're a great ear on the ground to understanding the local manufacturer's needs. From a tech scouting perspective, they are constantly like, we need this, do you have these sort of companies? And we're doing some matchmaking.
Hi, my name is Joel Yudkin. I'm a consultant called High Road Strategies. I work a lot in the manufacturing workforce space. First, I wanted to know what kind of products are you incubating and accelerating? I know, I mean, some of you already mentioned that. And the second is I would like you to speak, if you can, a little more on the workforce development component of what you're doing. I mean, are we just talking about engineers and I know that Haven, you talked in Chicago, you talked a bit more than I've heard other folks talk about.
Yeah.
Other kinds of jobs and the kind of workforce developments that you have going on. I'd like to hear what the rest of you were trying to do in your space, and how does this relate to folks who aren't engineers but yet are part of the communities, which right now many of them are some of them are around the area, are left behind communities. And we're talking, and I'm part of a network of folks who are trying to revitalize them.
Okay, I'll be quick. So most of the companies that are at Greentown and the startups that we work with are very B2C. They're industrial, and you'll probably never hear of most of them. But as an example, we have a hydrogen-fueled car. We've got really interesting indoor growing lights that's a modified LED. We've got different types of solar panels. We do clean tech, which is energy generation, all the way down to robotics that can provide efficiencies. So it's a lot of really cool stuff, but you kind of got to see it to totally understand it. As far as engineers, I am not one, so if that isn't blatantly clear to everybody. But we do, through the manufacturing initiative, work with some B2C customers, but they run the gamut as well. We do not deal directly with workforce development as a decision, because that is a whole hairy bear to deal with. What I would say we do, because I go out and meet a lot of manufacturers, and that's probably the second or third thing that we start talking about. Because, you know, Mikey's an expert, and he's been doing the same molds for 35 years, but they should have hired someone 7 years ago just to start learning what Mikey knows, and they're going to be screwed when he leaves, when he retires in 5 years. So what we do at Greentown and through our programming is try to raise the awareness about how cool manufacturing is by bringing kids through, frankly, advocating on behalf of manufacturers, because they're not very good at it by themselves. And we love our MEP, but they've got lots of things to do. So we try to make sure that people know this is no longer the blue-collar job that you probably think about that your grandpa had or whatever. It's something entirely different, but that is the extent that we get involved in workforce development.
Hi, so it's a very interesting question. I think there are left behind communities throughout the country, but there are a huge gap, if it's not already in each community, it's coming in terms of those skilled type of jobs that Michaela mentioned. When you think about sort of, you know, the breadth of the type of tech-based hardware companies that we've invested in, we've got a company that's doing small batch and medium batch carbon fiber composites. So they hire folks with all different kinds of backgrounds. They don't necessarily have to be engineering. We've got a company that is doing microzone control HVAC. Think of Nest for each room, but doesn't have to be a thermostat. We've got a company that's doing a robotic sorter at the point of disposal for trash and recycling, so we can improve our recycling streams. And as part of all of that, a lot of the companies, not all, but a lot of the companies that we invest in are focused on B2B. And that's where it marries well with the manufacturing community, which has over 8,000 manufacturers in southwestern Pennsylvania. And what you'll see now is exactly what Michaela said. It's not the grandfather or even the father's job anymore. And there's a lot of initiatives, both from the middle school, high school level, with a program called Bots IQ, of which I'm an advisor for, that gets kids very interested in thinking about robotics at a very early stage. There's all the fab labs all over that kids can explore. But on top of that, manufacturers now and B2B are really thinking about automation. I think we're on the cusp of really finally commercializing a lot of great opportunities for automation. As part of that, we at InnovationWorks offer the Innovation Adoption Program, and just yesterday I was in a precision machining company that serves the nuclear industry, and they're taking a very small spring with 7 different operations and looking to create a robotics system for it. So I think even with the idea that there are left behind communities, there are so many initiatives out there, if we can get the word out, where folks can really engage at all levels of skills in this new manufacturing.
There's a program that just launched in New York City from the Small Business Administration that is training, it's a partnership with industry, and they're training individuals on specific machinery. Sorry about that. There's a program from the SBA in New York City that just launched. It's modeled on a program out of Vermont. They're partnering with industry to identify machinery that they need specialists in, and what the city is doing is they're paying and facilitating the training that guarantees them a job at one of these industry partners when they're done. They're really nicely paid jobs, and they don't require any sort of educational background, so folks are able to continually learn and add to their skill set around that machine over time, and they're guaranteed employment afterwards. They just launched, and I think they had 1,000 applications for a first round of a program. So we've seen things like that that are starting to pop up around this community that kind of tie new technology to more legacy manufacturers.
Two kind of really interesting multipliers on the manufacturing side. One is that in terms of jobs, one is that startup manufacturers, especially in integrated newer manufacturers who might be bigger and never be kind of a little startup, need social media help, they need marketing help, they need website help, they need HR help, they need a lot of different help outside of just tooling. So they're looking for people in the ecosystem to help them as like a creative design at a startup manufacturer to increase the value of the products because they're expanding the value of the brand is something we're seeing a ton of in New York City. The second thing is that the workforce problems are based on a billion different things, but one of them is just that manufacturing wasn't growing, and now it is. So you have companies who are investing in saying, yeah, we'll put $1,500, $2,000, $3,000 a month towards a transition program or match with the city because we are growing, we do have new jobs, and the guy who used to be junior, we actually need him to be senior now. So we have space to train. I know there's a trio of questions over here. We'd love to do like a batch question, so if you guys all want to just raise your hand up, ask your question, and then after you get all 3, we'll see.
Yeah, I'll write these ones down.
I'm not sure if this can be batched. I'll lay it out there. I'll look at you, Brittany, but perhaps Haven and all the panelists can jump on this. I'm Scott Frost. I support the Department of Defense. I loved listening to Brittany's story about the business incubator in Youngstown. Your legacy business is software startups, and then you had that seminal 2012 event where America Makes was planted in Youngstown, and then you were part of that partnership that formed up. The question is, given this 20-year debate about should America be a service-based economy, have we lost the manufacturing hardware side in that legacy? Perhaps, and maybe it was fortuitous, maybe it was luck, brilliance, whatever you could say about what happened with you. Are you seeing a new model of startup manufacturer that perhaps
now is that blend of software and hardware production or manufacturing in Industry 4.0, Internet of Things, mass customization, smart sensors, industrial controls, digital manufacturing? Or are you still, is it more of a binary, you're still just working software startups versus manufacturing startups? Is there a blended hybrid model now that you're seeing?
I think that's a really great question, Scott. You know, for us, it was a big leap in a lot of people's minds to go from software to additive manufacturing. But our previous CEO, Jim Kostler, is always looking for ways to connect people, connect ideas, connect things. And I think it was foresight on his part when we saw America Makes coming to build our external network, build our support system, look at new opportunities, look where the puck's going. And I think that when he started working with those additive companies before we really built up our industry expertise for the additive startups, I think he always had it in his mind that these companies would work together, and whether by fortune or luck, as you had said, you know, we saw our first additive startup come to us, and they were a software company, and they really wanted to be Windows for, you know, the desktop printers. So seeing the blend, and because our software companies are working in the same space as of now, but eventually they will be broken apart, you know, seeing how they can help each other and the synergies that you were talking about earlier, we have expanded into IoT, specifically industrial. So now it's how can our manufacturers that we work with, whether startups or not, how can they adopt IoT? How can we use artificial intelligence for the manufacturing space? So we've seen a ton of synergies in our partnership with Team Neo because they have so many clusters, like the biomedical. We've been able to inject our additive startups into the biomedical space and create partnerships with local hospitals. Our foundation of our incubation program is truly on synergies and getting people to have that magic moment, and I think we'll continue to see more of that.
Hi, I'm Mario Danera from Enforcec. Could you mention briefly what are the limiting factors for your company's supply?
Just go down.
Money.
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 I think it's understanding of how to manufacture. We hear all the time that people would like to manufacture close to home. They just don't know where to go to find those folks. So I'd say that's a big need.
Yeah, I would echo financing is a little more complex with folks that are actually making something as compared to software companies. A lot of investors are solely investing in startups, software companies. And then finding that right expertise, I think, to make the product as cheaply as possible tends to be a bit of a challenge where their margins are just too slim to make a profit.
One word like Michaela, money.
Definitely money, but also expertise. And we've started as a community to invest in our youth and teach them the principles of 3D printing and design thinking. So building up the workforce at an early age.
I'll just add, I'd say before centers like all of ours, it was access to capital-intensive equipment, access to engineers, access to networks. We're checking those boxes, but access to capital is still a huge box that needs to be checked.
Yes, and given that you've all touched upon the movement of capital, goods, services, and labor, sometimes cross-border, as you mentioned, Haven, that with much to gain from the U.S. joining the TPP and much to lose from a renegotiation of NAFTA, how are you, one, engaging your members of Congress in your respective districts on these issues of export promotion and advanced manufacturing development, and also even to those in these communities who may not be directly impacted by this or don't even perceive that this affects them? How are you communicating to them that this is an opportunity here that we should really be engaging on a global level? Just bridging that gap.
We do no advocacy at MHub as a 501c3 nonprofit, so have no position on any of that.
We too are a 501c3, but I think part of the answer to your question is that agencies like the EDA and the continued support of the EDA Regional Innovation Startup Startup Act is really important. We've been able to benefit from having a lot of interagency, federal and also obviously state support. And I think that I think from the perspective of having the government make more sustainable programs would reach a lot of these divides, like the rural versus the urban, additional capital, additional resources, additional access.
Yeah, we're a 501c3 as well.
We're city backed.
I would like to learn what challenges you guys have while communicating with the small business or try to outreach to them.
In like,
Any small business that is involved in manufacturing.
do you mean like us talking to our members and like what are the challenges we
Right,
face there?
So for example, you try to find new members. You
Yeah.
try to search for those who need your help. What is the best route and what challenges have you had so far?
I don't think I should be the first person to answer that.
I'll take that on. So if you think about, we don't have a member model, but if you think about small businesses, our startups, as I think a number of people mentioned here, is when they get through their initial prototype generation, they need help in design for manufacturing and scaling their business. And from a manufacturer standpoint, and specifically small and mid-sized manufacturers, one of the things that we do through our program called Scalable Innovation is we try to have these manufacturers engaged in our networks to support this development of new technologies. And sometimes it's really hard. I was a manufacturer. I ran a manufacturing company for 13 years. Your nose is to the grindstone every day, and every week you're worrying about payroll and customers and orders and so forth. So having them get out of their existing sort of networks and explore new things is something that, depending on the manufacturer, is a bit of a challenge. But as this ecosystem continues to grow, it gets easier.
Yeah, I would say, just to add to that, a lot of the CEOs and entrepreneurs that we deal with that have some kind of manufacturing component tend to be engineers. And so that presents a bit of a challenge when they have to go sell that product or pitch to investors. And so recognizing that just continuing to retool that product over and over and making it more and more perfect, which is what engineers always want to do, isn't necessarily going to be the best path to commercialization. And they may need another co-founder, or they may need another senior level hire to help them through some of the other aspects of the business. And so convincing them of that can be a bit of a challenge, but the payoff has been really great when they do take that feedback and act.
I would say I would agree with both of these women and what they said, but I think the biggest thing that we find is the technology is changing so fast that people's reality is also changing. So they can plan for something that's going to happen in 6 months, and something has changed dramatically. So one of the approaches we've taken to addressing that is not putting kind of very removed C-suite type mentors in the room. We actually put founders of companies that are just a year or two ahead. We find that folks really respond to those folks, and they tend to have their finger on the pulse of where everything is headed.
Can I just kind of add one last thing too? The thing about startups is, and particularly hardware startups, I'd say, is they don't know what they don't know, and they don't want to know what they don't know sometimes. And so figuring out how to explain to them that by doing one or two things differently, you're proving the negative, that they're not going to waste time or money or increase their burn rate, that you're actually going to help them if they've never failed that way before. And so that's always a little tricky, but I think that's probably what we all try to do here a little bit is, frankly, I say help them fail faster and smarter.
Questions. We're gonna successfully iterate on this batching. So you'll ask a question, no one will answer. You'll ask a question, and then they'll take these last two questions all at once, and then we'll close with Andy. Cool?
Sure. So, just I was gonna say, what challenges or alternatively, what resources do you offer in terms of helping your members or your community with cybersecurity issues or IP issues? If they're coming to you, helping to meet like they have ideas, most likely some of these startups are not considering it as long-term IP or security
world of manufacturing, all of you talked about designing for manufacturing processes, resources, finances, and all of that. To me, one of the basic elements of manufacturing begins by identifying the marketplace. Whatever idea I have, is someone going to buy it? So who's providing that support? Who's providing that kind of guidance?
I'll take the second question. That's a really, really good point. I think you heard a lot of folks here say that not all, but many of these entrepreneurs and founders are engineers who don't necessarily have a sales hat on. And so over time, as we've iterated on our cycle curriculum, we have put more and more focus on sales, on business development. We have built our mentor network to get them connected to customers, whether it's in a trial, paid or not paid, and to get them out there trying to understand what the market opportunity for them, are they really solving a pain point? And as Innovation Works, the parent, is one of the top seed stage investors, the biggest thing we look for is customer traction.
Yeah, I would say where our curriculum starts is with that question: who is the customer? What is the market? We do have a lot of teams that show up that have a brilliant idea, but maybe a customer of one, and we try to help them understand who they're going to sell to. To answer your question, I would say there's a bit of a trend, at least with the companies at MHub, where intellectual property and tying up your brilliant idea isn't as important as sort of building a brand and getting speed to market and getting that immediate customer feedback. So a lot of our companies are focused on that. Sure, there are some fundamental technologies. So I have a company called New Current at MHub. They've developed an inductive charging antenna for charging pacemakers, cell phones, et cetera. They've wrapped that whole thing up with 27 different patents. And it's a good thing, too, because they just filed a lawsuit against Samsung for $500 million because they were literally working with Samsung to help them figure out how to put their antennas into their phones. And then Samsung went quiet, and then the new phone comes out. They cut that phone up, and their IP's in there right now. So, I mean, a product, not so important. A technology, IP is very important.
Yeah, I would say we thoroughly vet the intellectual property before we invest. And should they need additional assistance getting patents in other countries or things like that, we work with a number of attorneys that specialize in whichever industry that that company is within. I mean, life science is going to be very different from a software technology or a hardware technology.
Okay, well, please join me in thanking the panel.